All right. Welcome everyone to the second day of the Midwestern History Conference and to the academic panel on African Americans in the 20th century Midwest. I'm Karis Blaker, the chair for this panel, as well as one of three presenters you'll hear from soon. Also presenting today is Melissa Ford of Slippery Rock University and Paul Spychalski, an independent scholar from Austin, Minnesota. All right. So starting us off today is Melissa Ford. Pull up. All right. Melissa Ford is an assistant professor of history at Slippery Rock University in Western Pennsylvania, where she specializes in African American history, women's history, and Black radicalism. Her first book, A Brick and a Bible, Black Women's Radical Activism in the Midwest During the Great Depression, is due out with Southern Illinois University Press in spring 2022. Congratulations. She's a former Black Metropolis Research Consortium Fellow and has published in HNet and American Communist History. She is a fifth generation Midwesterner. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Karis. I just have to acknowledge I stole the fifth generation Midwesterner fact from Dr. McDuffie, who's in the chat. So yes, I did copy on that. But thank you so much. And I do believe I have a slideshow. Are you able to?
Yes, let me.
My title for my presentation today is Scottsboro North, Black Women and the Struggle for Racial Justice in Depression Era Cleveland. And this is part of my book that's forthcoming. And I just want to kind of highlight a few stories that I came across in my research in Black activism and specifically African-American working class women in Cleveland during the Great Depression. And so,
sorry, Melissa, I don't have screen sharing permissions.
all right.
Regard, is there a way to fix that?
Yes, just a moment. I will
get
that taken care of.
All right, don't worry, I can talk about nothing. I'm a professor. So my book and my project focuses on 4 Midwestern cities and the Black radical efforts during the Great Depression. And I think it really came to fruition and why this mattered during my grad school studies in St. Louis University during the Ferguson protests. As the Ferguson erupted, the Ferguson Rebellion, uprising as it's called, people around the country were asking, why Missouri? How could this happen in the Midwest? What's going on? And we heard the same things last summer about Minnesota and Minneapolis. How could this happen in the Midwest? And as a white person growing up in the Midwest, it was like, well, yeah, I wonder how could it happen? But as someone who began to study the history and understand that this Black agitation, this Black activism is as old as the Midwest. The panel yesterday about Black Midwestern History Matters was so excellent in talking about how you cannot understand American history, you cannot understand Black history without understanding the Midwest. And so you cannot understand where we are today and things like Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd murders without understanding this radical Black history. And so part of my project is reclaiming the Midwest as a site of radicalism, and not only radicalism, but Black radicalism, and at the center of that, Black women. So I'm going to start with a story because I love stories. So you go to the first slide. Now, I don't have a photo of this. Of course, we're talking 1930, so it's going to be very difficult. We're also talking Black women, working class women, often going to be difficult to capture them. But this is an illustration from the Communist Journal Working Woman from 1931 that I think helps illustrate this story. So I'll read it to you. In a downpour of freezing rain and sleet, Mary Tabb, an unemployed African-American worker, marched to Cleveland City Hall in thin clothing and torn shoes. Fed up with habitual unemployment, hunger, lack of medical care, and unrelenting economic hardship, Tabb broke with traditional norms of Black women's respectability to confront white politicians and, in no uncertain terms, demand improved relief for her family and thousands of other working class families. "We'll not starve peacefully," she declared, to the face of the Cleveland mayor and the board of aldermen. Now, prior to the Great Depression, middle-class African-American families in Cleveland had enjoyed a relatively prosperous and stable life in the city because they embraced traditional values such as respectability and civic reform. However, for Mary Tabb, that era of reform-minded Black clubwomen and churchwomen had passed, as the widespread hardship of the Great Depression necessitated taking Black activism to the next level, and that included Black women's activism. So many other African-American women in Cleveland had similar experiences, and so to Mary Tabb. Tabb is only one story that we have actually recorded, and it is due to the records of the American Communist Party. And so this study draws a lot from the Tenement archives in New York University. One issue that people who study the Midwest, and specifically people who study African Americans in the Midwest, is where do you find these archives? Where do you find these resources? So for my project, I of course went to Cleveland, but you also have to go digging in different places. We won't go too much into American communist history right now. I'll try not to assume any knowledge because it's complicated. But at the broad strokes, in the 1930s, the American Communist Party took a real interest in organizing African American workers in urban cities across the United States. And that is part of my project. My book project is looking at this and examining how thousands of Black women directly engaged with members of the American Communist Party to fight unfair wages, substandard working conditions, racial discrimination, hunger, poverty, homelessness, all these afflictions of the Great Depression, but doing so in really radical, active ways. And so because this really hasn't been looked at, and I hate to be that scholar, we're all kind of saying it, especially with Midwestern history, we all say, no one's looked at this history before. But no one's looked at this history before. And so in order to conceptualize it and to put it in a philosophical framework that works for African-American history in the 20th century, I offer my own term of Midwestern Black radicalism, which is very much in tradition of American communism, but also draws really strongly on African-American community building, Black women's history of resistance, and the lived experiences of Black women in the Midwest, like Mary Tabb, who, torn shoes, freezing rain, marches to City Hall and tells the white mayor, I'm not going to starve peacefully. And so that's what Black Midwestern radicalism is. And so I'm not going to define the Midwest, so we're just going to move on. Cleveland is the Midwest. There we go. I said it. I think that's a burden that only Midwestern historians bear, is trying to define your region. But I think the important thing also to think about Midwestern Black radicalism and the work all of us are doing here is that Midwestern history is more than just where that history happened, right? It is, yes, a location, but also it's the unique racial, political, geographic, economic, gendered, and spatial characteristics that make up the American heartland. And there's something both unique and representative about every city. The cities I look at, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and Cleveland, are all similar stories. But each are incredibly distinct and unique in their own stories. But in general, we see things during the Great Depression of urban development, similar patterns of urban development, industrialization, migration, residency, interactions of race, class, and gender. And really, though, at the heart of Midwestern Black radicalism and the heart of my history is the stories of the Black women. So I'll try to share some of those with you in the allotted time. So if we go on to the next slide, I am not a native of Cleveland. It's a beautiful city. I love visiting there for research and for fun. But Cleveland itself has rarely been on the radar for historians, and it's rarely on the radar for historians of African American history, and really not on the radar at all if you're talking about Black women's history. There is literally one book, Kimberly Phillips, Alabama North, which looks at Black women in the interwar period, which is fantastic and really where I drew a lot of my work from. But she doesn't look at the radicalism that is in this surprisingly very radical city. Often Cleveland is thought of kind of like, because it's more northeastern than most Midwestern cities, it's perceived as kind of like a northeastern offshoot. It's liberal, it has a liberal cultural history, upper class respectability, Protestants, all these kind of ideas that really are more in line with kind of New England culture and identity. And in terms of race relations, Cleveland really seemed more aligned with New England. They had a strong abolitionist population prior to the Civil War. Cleveland was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And by the end of the 19th century, most public facilities were non-discriminatory. Public schools were integrated, and in general, African Americans enjoyed better economic success than most urban Blacks in the Midwest. However, this success was limited very much to the Black upper and middle class, professionals, and highly skilled workers that had made the city their home. And these were business owners, adherents to Booker T. Washington's kind of self-help and accommodationist approach to civil rights. And they had really carved out this space for themselves in the Forest City, as Cleveland is known, in the Forest City, as that is African American population. So that was up until the Great Migration. Great Migration, beginning around 1915, however you want to define it, brought incredible change throughout urban Midwestern cities. I mean, many spaces across the United States, of course. But Cleveland found a particularly drastic change. In 1910, African Americans living in Cleveland only made about 2.3% of the population. By 1930, it was up to 8%, which meant around 900,000 residents of Cleveland were African American. Now, these African Americans who were drawn to Cleveland were drawn for reasons that we all know about the Great Depression. They were drawn for prospect of jobs, racial integration, because they knew somebody there who had established a life or a community. Now, Cleveland, though, surprisingly, was the Black population growth in Cleveland was second only to Detroit. Detroit in the 1930s and the Black population in Detroit has really been studied for good measure, because Black Detroit is just such a fascinating study. But there's no Black Cleveland book, even though there's this incredible percentage growth. Now, where did these Southern migrants end up? And that is a familiar story if you know your 20th century history. Cleveland, despite its non-discriminatory housing or non-discriminatory public facilities and lack of Jim Crow laws, we of course see racial prejudice reign supreme in housing segregation. And so many African Americans who moved to Cleveland ended up in around the 11th Ward, which is also known as Central Area, and which is the area I focus on for my study, because it is a highly densely populated community of African Americans and Southern migrants. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that this area corresponds greatly to what we all know and hate as the redlining, the homeowners loan corporation maps of the 1930s, showing areas that were deemed blighted, high risk for home loans, and there's no coincidence this was a largely African American neighborhood. During the Great Depression, the conditions of these neighborhoods are going to deteriorate. Black working class families across the United States were hit first and hit hardest. One aspect of how African Americans in Cleveland suffered during this time I look at is housing evictions. And this is a story that's come up in the past year during the pandemic of people who cannot pay their rent, who cannot find a job, and are being forced out of their homes because of that. In 1931, It's more than 8,000 families in Cleveland were evicted from their homes. By the next year, over 14,000. So we're talking about incredible amounts of people being turned out into the streets in supposedly this liberal, reform-minded city. Now, people fight back. That's always the course of history, right? People will fight back. It is in those stories of resistance we find inspiration and hope. The one organization that was very, let's say, vocal during this time about fighting back was the Unemployed Councils. The Unemployed Councils were an offshoot of the American Communist Party. They never officially aligned with the American Communist Party because to be a communist was still labeled risky, let's just say in the 1930s, but it was made up of a lot of communists. So basically the Unemployed Councils were local councils organized across the United States, mostly in urban areas, but also rural areas, to help alleviate immediate woes. Basically, they organized soup kitchens, helped people get on relief, they spoke out about unemployment, provided free lodging, provided free food for school children, and staged anti-eviction protests, and targeted African-American workers. In Cleveland, because it was such a liberal, reform-minded city, the city had really delegated relief efforts. By relief, I mean welfare here. Relief was the word they used in the 1930s, to private charities. And once the Depression hit, the private charities were swamped, overwhelmed, could not deal with this influx of needy people. And so the Unemployed Councils in Cleveland, as in other cities, stepped in. One very notable story, again, want to just kind of highlight some of these Black women who were movers and shakers, was an anti-eviction riot. So frequently, every year, every month, there's a newspaper article about a Black family being evicted from their home for lack of payment. But the Unemployed Councils would often stage a protest. They would carry the furniture back into the house. They would pass a hat for collections to pay the family's rent. They would turn on the electricity and heating back because there was no way that the sheriff and his few deputies could fight this mob of committed activists. However, this often erupted in violence, as one can imagine. An anti-eviction riot in 1931 left 2 Black men dead. They were aligned with the Unemployed Councils, and it was a huge tragedy, of course, for the city and for the activists in the city. But they didn't take it sitting down. One reaction, if you can go to the next slide. This is an image of the Cedar Central neighborhood. So around Central area where Black majority neighborhood is. Later, this is the neighborhood was raised for public housing, which again is a common story. But the next slide is a piece from, again, a communist journal, but talks about one of the reactions to the eviction riot that ended with 2 men dead. Maggie Jones was an African-American worker who, after the riot, observed that, quote, "Our women realize that we must be prepared to take care of our comrades who are injured in battles with the capitalist police." And so she helped organize a corps of female nurses. They studied and trained in first aid and emergency care, and were basically the frontline care responders in protests and marches and other organizing drives. And so Maggie Jones is a fascinating woman that really only appears for a brief time in communist records. But we are thankful for those records because we can see how she is a huge part of organizing after this riot to make sure that the community understands the collective power. So through marches, protests like this, Black women were able to assert radical activism and their own agency in shaping the city and the fight for racial justice. One of the huge issues, though, is going to be Scottsboro, just in one word. If you could go to the next slides, the Scottsboro boys. There's not enough time, but 9 young men who were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train near Scottsboro, Alabama. They were all condemned to death except one, and it became a huge world wide campaign to save them because it was obviously trumped up charges, everything was false. But it wasn't until the Communist Party got involved and the International Labor Defense got involved that it really became this was able to be publicized to a point where every Black community in the United States knew about Scottsboro and rallied around them. And Cleveland was no different. And if you go to the next slide, Cleveland actually set the stage for how Midwestern cities and cities outside the South and outside New York City protested. This is a May Day parade in 1931, and you can tell it's Cleveland in May because they're in their long coats. Activists in Cleveland became incredibly involved in the Scottsboro case because so many of the African American migrants had come from Alabama through chain migration and established communities. Many African Americans in Cleveland were from Alabama and knew families that knew the Scottsboro boys. And so for the next 5 years, Cleveland becomes a hotbed of activity for Scottsboro. You go to the next slide, these are a few pamphlets or flyers that I found, again, in the Communist Party archives that advertised meetings. And you can see they're not pulling any punches. Stop the murder. And also on the left here, colored and white working women stop the murder. So real call to women in this. These rallies would take place in central area, so in these Black neighborhoods and Black communities, where Black women could be those community leaders that for so long had not had access to those informal halls of power. And so, if you go to the next slide, one other story that I want to tell is it's not just Black Cleveland women who are getting involved and becoming huge spokespeople of the Scottsboro cause, but also the Scottsboro mothers. The mothers of the young men who were accused of rape came together with the help of the International Labor Defense, came together and went on an international tour to describe the plight of their boys and to describe what it meant to be a Black woman, working class woman in Alabama in the 1930s. And so one woman, one of the mothers, so all of the mothers traveled domestically. And Ada Wright, mother of two of the boys, actually traveled in Europe as well. But she came home to the United States and returned to Jim Crowism at its peak, not in Alabama, but in Alabama North, which is what many natives called Cleveland. In 1934, she visited a downtown restaurant where the pro-Nazi owner, yes, we're at that stage in American history where they're pro-Nazis in 1934, refused to serve her. The owner threw her out. After that happened, a group rallied around her, led by an African-American woman, rallied around her, sat down at the tables, and refused to stir. This was a sit-in. This was a lunch counter sit-in before we had Greensboro in the 1960s. A crowd of almost 1,000 people had gathered around the restaurant. There were speeches going on. Police looked on, but they were overwhelmed and really couldn't do anything. And eventually the restaurant owner acquiesced and the protesters were served. And so just another moment of Black women in Cleveland refusing to take that backseat role, refusing to play by the rules that for so long had prevented them from exerting their voices for the pursuit of racial justice. I know I'm running long, so a few other stories. The next slide is the founding of the Future Outlook League, which really helped to transition Cleveland from this real period of radical activism into a period of civic reform, where the idea of the Future Outlook League is the future is yours, basically emphasizing collective power of the Black community, finding jobs, finding and struggling for civil rights. And one woman who is key in the Future Outlook League, the last slide, is Maud White. Maud is actually a communist. She was trained in Soviet schools, incredibly, she's one of my heroes. She's also from Pittsburgh, which is where I live. But she came to Cleveland, where she was an organizer. But because the world and Cleveland was basically in this transition from Black radicalism to kind of more collective unity and coordinated efforts between radicals, but also liberals, between churches, and moderate organizations, Maud White was able to create those links. And through her efforts, she worked with settlement homes and created cultural programs for African American youth. She took her activist training and held sessions for women on how to organize picket lines and boycotts. Black women would often send food to the picketers and serve as shock troops, which basically were picketers who filled in the lines on a picket line. And this support really led one woman later to say that Black women were the Future Outlook League. And so these are just a few stories: Mary Tabb, Ada Wright, Maggie Jones, and Maud White, who best represent the various ways in which Black women engaged in radical activities during the Great Depression, specifically here in Cleveland. And so Cleveland itself was a challenge. Cleveland still has its challenges, to say the least, in terms of race relations. But the 1930s, rather than marking the end or the worst part of radical activism, marks the beginning in this city. And of course, it is Black women again who are forming that link and connection and tradition to today. So, thank you. Look forward to any questions about that. But now it is my privilege to introduce Karis Blaker. She's a graduate student at Loyola University Chicago and Dominican University, pursuing both an MA in Public History and an MLIS, respectively. She received her bachelor degree from the University of Michigan, where she studied women's studies, English, and writing. All three subjects inform her current historical work and interests. Most recently, Karis's work focuses on women's history, queer history, and print culture in the late 20th century. Her first published piece is titled Sojourner Truth and Her Contemporary Media, Reports of Identity, Intelligence, and Eloquence, published in volume 17 of Young Scholars in Writing. The piece she will present today is called Claiming Sojourner Truth, the Construction and Reconstruction of a Buried Hero in Battle Creek, Michigan. It is a continuation of her earlier work on the life and legacy of Sojourner Truth as a Midwestern hero. And I'm very excited to hear this, so I'll turn it over to Karis.
Thank you so much. I am just going to pull up my slides quickly, but first, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the other panelists. I'm very excited to present my work alongside you all. All right. All right. Okay, so I was actually planning on presenting this paper at last year's conference, which unfortunately never happened. But in a perpetual effort to talk about Sojourner Truth, I was happy to resubmit my paper for 2021. So my research on Sojourner Truth began in 2018 with a project that focused on her speeches and the broader perception of them. Being from Michigan, I was naturally drawn to the fact that she lived out the latter part of her life in Battle Creek, which is a really small city of about 50,000, very similar to the town I grew up in southeastern Michigan. And more importantly, Battle Creek is home to a 12-foot bronze statue of Truth. All right, so on September 25th, 1999, a 12-foot bronze statue of the formerly enslaved abolitionist, women's rights activist, preacher, and lecturer Sojourner Truth was unveiled in Battle Creek, Michigan's Monument Park. Truth was born Isabella Baumfree in New York in 1797. She escaped from slavery in 1827, becoming an itinerant preacher and adopting a new name to reflect her divine calling to sojourn the Midwest, spreading the truth. She's an orator best known for her 1851 speech that's commonly referred to as Ain't I a Woman? But there's some controversy around that. It was originally given at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851. In the late 1860s, she moved to Battle Creek, where she could be near two of her daughters and the Underground Railroad activity. After the end of the Civil War, Truth campaigned for women's suffrage and for formerly enslaved people to be resettled on government-owned land. Truth resided in Battle Creek until her death in 1883 and is buried in Battle Creek's Oak Hill Cemetery. Truth's connection to Battle Creek does run quite deep. Though she was primarily an itinerant preacher and lecturer, she settled in Battle Creek to be near family. She continued to travel and speak nationally after moving. And during the antebellum era, Truth helped enslaved people escape to freedom, though she did not work directly with the Underground Railroad. Battle Creek was, however, a major stop on the Underground Railroad for those seeking freedom, specifically in Michigan or Canada. So this part of Michigan became home to a large freed and self-freed Black community, which likely appealed to Truth, being one of those people. So by memorializing Truth in such a prominent way, Battle Creek is solidifying her legacy as part of their own history, and claiming that this kind of person, this kind of story is heroic and worth canonizing. However, the memorialization process and the aspects of her legacy most prominently displayed in the city reveal a tension between Sojourner Truth, the person, and Sojourner Truth, the symbol. The Monument of Truth was created by Tina Allen, a sculptor from Los Angeles, California, who won the National Association of Negro Business and Professional Women's Commission to build the statue. This particular sculpture is absolutely in line with the rest of Allen's work, all of which is dedicated to the representation of African Americans, which she describes as writing our history in bronze, using totems that tell the children that this kind of behavior, this kind of person is worthy of attention. And I think that is a great way to describe monuments, or what monuments in general should be doing. Allen's bronze Sojourner Truth sculpture is a massive 12 feet high and stands proudly in Battle Creek's Monument Park as a reminder of a life dedicated to equality and justice, despite the countless hardships that tried to limit her impact on the world. From the start of this monument making process, Allen had plans to incorporate the community's input to bring Sojourner Truth alive through the monument. There was a desire for Truth to be shown as an orator because of her long career as one. So this monument was mainly funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Battle Creek is known as like the cereal city. They have Kellogg and I think Post as well. Were both founded there. And the city of Battle Creek itself also funded the monument, and the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs. In total, the monument cost about $750,000 to $200,000. This monument is not telling just one story or compressing truth into a symbol rather than representing her as a real person. The monument itself emphasizes Truth's legacy as a speaker. Her hand is outstretched as if she is addressing the audience directly. She's also positioned at the front of an amphitheater on a raised platform, giving her a permanent platform on which to speak, which can be interpreted as sort of a remedy of the fact that Truth had to fight so hard for her own platform while alive. The monument also emphasizes religion and faith by depicting her right hand resting on a Bible, something absolutely central to Truth's life as a preacher. Around the edges of the amphitheater, which aren't shown here, but all around the edges are 6 pillars with different aspects of her life's message engraved on them, along with names of donors who made the building of the monument possible. 4 of the pillars have the word equality engraved on them. So that's heavily where their focus is. And one has the word faith, the last has the word freedom. The plaques on the brick wall behind the monument are engraved with direct quotes from her about the importance of speaking and living out one's truth. Rather than insisting truth stand in for just one thing, which those who chose how to situate the statue could have done, this monumental dedication insists instead that people emulate key aspects of her message, therefore keeping her legacy of bravery and equality alive. Truth's legacy is ingrained in the history of Battle Creek. There are various physical manifestations of Truth's memory in the city. Also the Sojourner Truth Institute, which was founded in 1998 by Dr. Velma Laws Clay, who vowed to expand the historical and biographical knowledge of Sojourner Truth's life work and carry on her mission by teaching, demonstrating, and promoting projects that accentuate the ideals and principles for which she stood. In addition to the Institute and her 12-foot bronze likeness in Monument Park, she is buried in Battle Creek's Oak Hill Cemetery. A person's burial site is generally considered a memorial to that person where loved ones can visit at other significant moments as a way to feel close to them. And for the Battle Creek community to have such a prominent historical figure buried among many of their relatives and friends is a significant factor in their connection to her. Not only does Truth's statue reside in Battle Creek, but her last resting place is also there, making her physical memory an incredibly tangible connection for the community to her life and to her legacy. I want to talk for a minute about history and memory as 2 distinct ways of recalling the past. Because memory is fluid and dynamic, it's also highly contestable, making silence and erasure entirely conceivable. Within the context of remembering and forgetting exists an inherent authority over public memory, often belonging to a privileged majority. So essentially the privileged majority gets to dictate the memory. Battle Creek, their public memory of Sojourner Truth can be analyzed under this framework. Most of the press around the 1999 unveiling of the statue depicts a positive, warranted public memory by which Battle Creek gets to claim Truth and her values as representative of their own. Secondary research indicates the process of publicly remembering is far more complicated and prompts the question, whose story is this? It's important to consider how Sojourner Truth's image is being used, maybe even reconstructed to serve certain purposes in Battle Creek's public memory. For instance, would Truth have claimed the same level of connection to Battle Creek that Battle Creek claims to have to her? Was her experience as a Black person in a predominantly white area the positive and welcoming one that Battle Creek is so proud of? Is the city using her association with it to claim a history of activism and equality that's not so prevalent in actuality? Coverage of the unveiling of Truth's monument positions her crusade for equality as part of Battle Creek history, but as if the inequality Truth was fighting no longer exists in present-day Battle Creek. Gender is also a factor to consider regarding Truth's memorialization, since Traditional gender roles make it so women are not often remembered in forms of public memory, especially monuments, which are typically reserved to celebrate successes in war, politics, science, leadership, exploration, all traditionally male successes. So with this argument in mind, it's worth asking, does Battle Creek benefit from claiming Sojourner truth so positively in their public memory? Is that benefit mutual, or is truth story being appropriated? Battle Creek's public memory of truth is represented in various ways today as well as in the past. The Historical Society of Battle Creek and the Sojourner Truth Institute of Battle Creek are two organizations that promote the city's legacy of activism, as well as contribute to this claim on Sojourner Truth. On the Historical Society website, under the heading The Freedom City, in the history section is an account of the city's legacy as a place of refuge for people with different points of view and non-traditional attitudes, a notion set up by the Quakers in the area. The website mentions Battle Creek's participation in the Underground Railroad and the fact that freedom seekers passing through often chose to stay and set up homes, churches, and businesses in Battle Creek. The Sojourner Truth Institute's website, created in collaboration with the Historical Society of Battle Creek, describes its goal of carrying out truth's mission. Dr. Velma Laws Clay, who founded the Institute, is praised on the website for her passion to preserve and educate others about Sojourner Truth's legacy. Dr. Clay apparently served as the chair of the Sojourner Truth 200th birthday anniversary celebration and of the Sojourner Truth Monument Project. According to these public-facing resources, Battle Creek takes its connection to Sojourner Truth and its legacy of freedom very seriously. Truth's monument is material evidence for the community's pride and their racial conciliation, making it more of a reflection on how the city desires to view itself rather than how someone like Truth might have viewed it, or even if it might be viewed externally and in actuality today. Battle Creek's public memory of Sojourner Truth becomes problematic when analyzed in light of an indication that public memory is complicated by factors of race and gender. Media coverage of the public unveiling of Truth's monument describes a positive, warranted public memory by which Battle Creek gets to claim truth and her values as representative of their own. Other sources dedicated to a certain representation of Battle Creek history do this as well. However, according to a notable truth scholar, Roseanne Manzik, who was really essential for both of these projects that I did on truth, she says, public memory is a process that locates material commemorations through the gradual erasure of complex details. Therefore, figures like truth exist in public memory simply as an abstract representation of community ideals. The question of who gets a monument and who gets to be included in the canon of American heroes is still something that historians and other members of the nation grapple with today. These monument controversies seem to be about an urgency to write certain histories in stone. Whose stories are these monuments telling is an important question to ask. What does it mean for history to be written in stone? And even more importantly, is it? I'm sorry about the sirens. So what struck me, so I did a field visit to Battle Creek because it wasn't far when I was living in Ann Arbor. So I spent a day there just being in front of the monument, which is a surreal experience. Seeing the human form in 12 feet of bronze is really something else. But what struck me about my visit to Battle Creek is that among all of the city's history, which is extensive, all the stories that they could be telling, they continue to tell Sojourner truths. Monument Park has two other monuments, one to cereal company founder C.W. Post, and the other a collection of stones by a local historian meant to pay tribute to various historical people and places. The Situation in Truth's monument is by far the most prominent in the park. So the situation of truth among these two other figures is connected to her value as a symbol of local pride. But there's a limit to what symbols can do, what they can change. That's my joke. The most highlighted aspect of Truth's message in Battle Creek and around the monument is her dedication to the truth. So much so that her entire message seems to be compressed down to truth. In doing this, some of the specificity of her message is being lost. What does it mean to tell the truth? Whose truth are we telling? The truth is subjective. It can mean different things to different people. So what is it that by asking people to live out their truth, what do we mean by that? Truth itself is losing meaning in favor of emotion. For Battle Creek to take that to be the essence of Truth's legacy does indicate that the ongoing construction of local history is influenced by her in more of an emotional way than in an objective way. Still, Sojourner's truth is an American hero, and I feel a powerful connection to her just knowing that she resided in my home state of Michigan for a short time. The monument itself offers more questions than answers. The process of memorializing and publicly remembering can be done more or less problematically. The way this is done in Battle Creek, even if truth is made into a symbol of subjectivity and racial reconciliation, does reflect the admiration that the city has for her story and the honor many of its residents feel to have such a tangible and visual connection to a national hero like Sojourner Truth. This temporary art installation was unveiled on Tuesday. Images of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X are part of the installation, which is called Demand Justice. It's located across from Buckingham Fountain along Chicago's lakefront in an area called Queens Landing. I wanted to end on this note first so that anyone else who might be in Chicago can go see it. And secondly, to acknowledge the arduous and continuous effort to demand justice for centuries of exploitation and violence against Black Americans. Monuments and other public prominent installations like these are a form of national storytelling, and monuments like this and truths are vehicles for social change. Thank you. And I have sources if anyone. All right. So now, moving right along. Paul, hello.
Hello. You can set me up for a screen share.
Great.
All right. I know we're a little tight on time. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. So thank you to our professors. Good morning from Austin, Minnesota. I'm actually independent scholar. I practice primarily criminal law with a public defense contract. So pretty aware of race issues in society. And so when I come at things from a baseball perspective, I do tend to look at things Black baseball with Black baseball treatment. Yesterday, talking about visiting some of the presentations, talking about how we focused on those in the past. And part of the reason that this is focused on Black baseball 1901 to 1903 has to do simply with the fact that from 1901 to 1903, there was a Black baseball team, or at least use of Black baseball players in Algona, Iowa. Those of you that are Midwest scholars, particularly Iowa scholars, kind of know that if you know where Algona even is in north central Kossuth, Iowa, in the 1900s, you probably know that is not a typical population for or a settlement area for Black immigrants to Iowa. Typically Des Moines along the river and that. And on the right side, taken some of the census information showing that in 1900, there were 3 African Americans per the census. And if we go back to the census, there's actually 1 Black family living in Algona, Iowa. Both of them had been emigrated, brought from the South, and had a child of unknown origin living with them. What's interesting about that family is the coverage of that family, which is a little bit outside the topic of the paper, but he's generally portrayed and covered kind of as a sad sack coverage in the papers leading up to this. Also, going to just give you some information for people who are on the panel or viewing the panel who are not that familiar with Iowa. There's a little bit of coverage of an incident in Waterloo. So I've highlighted that and given you some of the census data just to go along to give you kind of a place where this occurred if you were to go back and look at a map. And so what happens in 1901, Algona hires its first black ball player. That player is Ed Doggy Woods. He had originally played with Michigan's Page Fence Giants team and had bounced around quite a bit. In 1900, he had been playing up in Waseca, Minnesota, about 3 counties north of Kossuth there, with the Waseca Eco flower team, kind of a famous Midwest team, for those of you that follow baseball. And while with them, that team traveled to Algona and he threw a shutout against Algona. But late in the season, Waseca hired 2 of the best pitchers in baseball, and he basically became a free agent. So ultimately, 2 former Page Fence Giants, George Hopkins and Pete Burns, joined Woods in Algona, along with George Williams and Kissing Bug Rose in 1901. And they put together a very impressive team. Algona's team that year had played 65 games. They won 30, despite the on-field success. The language in the team owner, E.J. Murtaugh's diary, kind of indicates his sentiments on race, referring to his salary team of 11 players, including 5 darkies and a horrible spelling of one Indian player who came from the Flandreau Indians team. In terms of how this was perceived otherwise, Whitmore, which is a town about 11 miles west of Algona, had this to say about Algona fielding an integrated team, referring to them as the darky team, having a baseball team on it, and generally objecting to them being on the field together. This generally occurred through most of the papers, depending on location. So they're recognized for their work on the field, but criticized for their color. There was a proposed game at Marathon, Iowa on August 12th that featured the headline, and it would be a great ball game, indicating that the all-white Manson Tigers, a very small team in central Iowa, and the Algona Coons will cross bats here Monday. The article described the Manson team as good, clean players while proclaiming that the Algona team, too, is composed of ball players who know their business. And besides being well upon in the business, they are the jolliest lot of coons, Indians, and whites that ever chased the sphere over a diamond. Most of the advertising for ball games was primarily in print articles. Skipped ahead. And you can see an example of that here from the Milford, Iowa. This is over a little bit closer to Lake Okeechobee, if you know where that is, Spencer, Iowa. Again, print articles demonstrating that even though we have black ball players, we have to go out of our way to find ways to refer to them, this time as watermelon eaters. The colored gentlemen, again, recognizing that they know how to play the game, but they cannot avoid making references to the race, again, indicating that the local team had been blackballed because they'd been beaten by this particular team. Later that season, there was an advertisement, and there's not a lot of print advertising at this time period. Space is fairly expensive. There's not a lot of art set up. But as we look at the portrayal of the teams that would be on that, of the members of the teams, we can again see that there's some racial inferences that are being made about this particular team. Again, they had a good season. They won a number of ball games. And before departing for the season, Pete Burns, who had been the catcher, supposedly made a list of ball players and gave it to the team ownership and said that if Algona wanted an even stronger team next year, these are the players that you should have. Again, based on his experience, he played a lot in the Chicago area, played with the Page Fence Giants. And what happens is the team ownership took that list, and instead of basically filling Whitmore's complaints. Instead of having an integrated team, they said, we'll have an all-black baseball team in 1902. Strangely, they then adopt the name the Algona Brownies, which in hindsight to us may seem offensive, but it is what they adopted. And as cringeworthy as that may be, as we look at it, again, press coverage from the area, we see that the press goes out of its way to find other ways to refer to this team of all black ball players. Aggregation of cakewalkers, the Coon Nine, referring to them as blackberries, the loose jointed blackberry pitcher, the crack coon team of Algona, and again, the cakewalkers on it. So the coverage of this team kind of gives us an indication of the racial views of this area of rural Iowa. Basically, it gives us a lens to look at what they're looking at. This is an interesting story, again, looking not necessarily at the local press, but also how it's picked up in Iowa and beyond. On the left is a story from the Daily Freeman, which is actually pretty cringeworthy. Indications are this was actually a made-up account, but on the right, we will see that it was actually picked up and carried in a newspaper in Montana, indicating that one of the rival teams, the Webster City Iowa team, they played many, many games, actually played for the semi-pro championship in 1902 in Iowa, had a monkey as a mascot, and they used it to intimidate these black ball players. Brought them over to the dugout, would bring them over to the batters, and that was actually picked up nationally. Indications from Webster City was that this was actually a made-up account, but pretty horrible as it was. The 1902 season, they were pretty successful on the field again. On September 3rd, they had a grudge match for the semi-pro championship at Des Moines. On a neutral field, they beat Webster City 4-3. If they did have a monkey, it didn't work that day for the hoodoo. But the strength of this Algona team is borne out. They won 71 games, drew 2 out of 103 games played. On the field, they were very successful. Esterville, Iowa, a couple counties to the west of Kossuth there, kind of indicating its preference, its indications of what it thought about the race of the players. On the left, we have the indications referring to African backgrounds. Again, the dark scheduling, dark baseball team on it, giving us again an indication of kind of the racial perceptions of this very rural area of Iowa during this time period. On the field, the Brownies actually improved in the 1902 season. They had brought in one of the star players from the Waseca team as a pitcher, and he was quite dominant. This is the 1903 team. Again, all black for the most part. If there was an injury out in Iowa, there were not a lot of black players to go and recruit, so they would occasionally bring in a town ball player to fill in. Off the field, this is, I find interesting anyway, a story of a fight on a train. On the left, there's an article from the Waterloo Courier that kind of portrays a fight on the train as a fight, basically a racial fight between the ball team and this carnival setting. If we look at the Alligator paper, though, it's interesting because there's a problem with a member of the carnival crew. The conductor comes to the baseball team and says, "Can you help?" And the baseball team goes and does it. And if you think about it, this ball team playing 103 games is likely riding these trains all the time. It's the only way they can get to games. They would be familiar with the conductors, and a few of them had been boxers at other times. But the difference in how they are portrayed and covered in the press, and we'll see Waterloo may have had an axe to grind, particularly with blacks and ball players. In a few slides later. The Brownies were almost too successful on the field. They defeated Chicago's best baseball team in a multiple game series. It was played across all the way from Chicago to Western Iowa, finishing the series, I believe, in Algona. That same team from Chicago played in Waterloo. This is the slide I was referencing. And you can see that the Waterloo Courier editor is upset with this idea of the intermingling of races on the field again. suggesting that if we continue to allow black ball players to even be on the field and play white teams, it'll encourage more blacks to come to Waterloo. It will allow a colony to set up, encourage them to be there. There were, according to census, about 22 blacks in the area at the time. But again, giving us through baseball a little bit of a perception of at least some of the ideas towards race in this area, not of large migration into Iowa. In fairness, I will say that this appears to be the opinion of the editor. I'm not sure how widespread it was in Waterloo, and it was actually pretty well panned by many of the other papers. In the interest of time, I'm just going to keep going fairly quickly here. The final instance I was going to cover is there was a series towards the end of the 1903 season. They had conquered most everything in Iowa. They had played most everything in Minnesota to the championship, and they were lined up to play basically the best team or the champions in Canada. And on the left, you can see the coverage of that from New Hampton, which is a smaller town, again, in central Iowa. A lot of this is pretty rural, referring to this team, again, champions of Iowa, but it's the Coons versus the Canucks. So you again see that racial issue played out. They had every opportunity to refer to them as the Algona Brownies, the Iowa champions, but they chose to refer to them as the Coons. On the right side, one of the first games of this series was played in St. Paul, Minnesota. And during that game, the pitcher who'd come from Waseca, Bill Holland, was pitching a great game. And unfortunately, he beaned a white ball player from Winnipeg. That white ball player dropped, was taken to a hospital, and physician was seen. Indications were that it was going to go poorly. Some thought he was going to die. William Holland was initially arrested and then released when they figured out that this was basically a pitch that got away. It was not intentional. What's interesting, though, is as you follow the progression of that story, branching out from St. Paul to areas of Iowa, even further west into the Dakotas, the story becomes the player who was hit is near death, likely to die, while Holland is arrested. No indications in most of the papers that he was released, found not at fault, and no going back to cover the story again. And so indications again that the press has kind of the way that they are portraying coverage of things or being at least selective in terms of their coverage. So kind of as a conclusion of this, and I know we're short on time, but so what does this tell us about racial relations in Iowa? We have what is regarded as one of the best black baseball teams of all time, at least west of Ohio, playing during this time period, but their treatment is quite uneven from the local press, referred more to about race than even their abilities on the ball field for a lot of portions of this. And even when they have the opportunity to cover them in certain ways, they choose to emphasize the racial relations of the fight rather than perhaps being asked to participate. Even though we have this name Algona Brownies, which to me is, I think, unfortunate, but most black ball teams did in many ways want to signify they were black baseball teams because they tend to play better, had the entertainment aspects. Editors still went out of the way to refer to the team as Coons, the Coon team, cakewalkers, and blackberries. And it seems to be simply for that racial component. It's also interesting as we look at this to look at what stories were carried beyond Iowa forward. That monkey business carried all the way to Anaconda, even though it may have even been a fictitious story, but why would that carry over? Again, looking at the beaning incident with your breast, why does that in particular carry forward? And the three main articles that get carried the furthest are the fight on the train, the monkey business, and the beating incident, not the strength of the players, not the record on the field that goes with it. And in terms of why we stop at 1903, ultimately what happens in Iowa is that most of the teams that they played, Fort Dodge, Webster City, they would play those teams many, many times. They were the strongest teams in the area. joined affiliated baseball in 1904. And so Algona, assuming they could afford to bring back these players were being paid $65 to $150 a month to play, basically lost the opportunity to play the best teams, have the best gates on which to be paid. So in essence, what happened is the color line was drawn, preventing Algona from bringing back this team if they were going to. And as we talk about race going forward in the Midwest, just going back to the color line was initially drawn by Cap Anson from Marshalltown, Iowa, for it, even though we tend to gloss over some of those facts and figures. So I know I went really quickly on it, but I think we're close to the end of this session. But if we have questions, I'll throw it back to Karis.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, so we only have a few minutes left. If anyone, I am keeping an eye on the chat. If anyone wants to post a question for any of the panelists, I'd be happy to facilitate that. Okay, we have one from Leo for Phil. Anson was racist, but now is absolved of color line. Any indication that J.L. Wilkinson, B.B. Hoff, from Algona and founding owner of Negro League's KC Monarchs, was aware or connected to this team? Any of those figures? Hall of Fame. Okay, Baseball Hall of Fame. I got you, Leo. Thank you.
All right, I can take that one. It looks like it's directed to me. I'm not sure that it's clear that Anson's been but I don't know that he's been absolved. J.L. Wilkinson, he may have certainly been aware of the team, but I've looked, I haven't found any direct connection to him at this point. They're very close in years. Wilkinson was a pitcher for the town team, I think actually before it in like 1895. But I think it moved on to Des Moines at that point.
We also have one from Melissa from Joe Allen. In the Communist archives, did you see any reference to Black women's involvement in World War I activities?
That's a good question. And this goes back to some details and technicalities of the Communist Party. The American Communist Party wasn't formed until 1919, so after World War I. To talk about the Black women's radicalism, there were always been Black radical women, as Karis mentioned. Sojourner Truth, I'd claim her as pretty radical. She's rad. Let's just be sure about that. So no, there was not any sort of organized resistance in for Black women radicals, and really up until the we don't see that collective effort of the Communist Party organizing Black women until 1929, when Lenin basically said to do so.
All right, and clarification that, yeah, the language of colored teams versus white teams being folded into a larger narrative or a larger all-white league, an important thing to acknowledge.
Yeah, yeah. Part of my research is, why did the team start? Why did the team end? There's nothing definitively stated on why they left. That's kind of my research question on it is, is it because they lost their opponents because they joined a white league and would be unable to play and gain the gate revenue is my theory on it. And we'll see where it goes. Algona certainly could have had an all-white team and played in the league, but they couldn't if they continued to field Black ball players.
I wanted to ask a question for Karis, if that's okay. I love your study of the monument of Sojourner Truth, and I'm struck by other monuments of Black women monuments, and they're very few, but some that have been created more recently are monuments to Rosa Parks, and now specifically she sits in the Capitol Rotunda or whatever, and she's literally sitting though. And I was wondering, the Sojourner Truth sculpture seems such a difference than Rosa Parks, because in almost every sculpture of Rosa Parks, she's sitting. And so was this intentional? How does that reclaiming of very, like her being larger than life and being at a podium and speaking, it seems like such a reclamation of her voice rather than Rosa Parks performing one single action.
Yeah. Sojourner Truth was 6 feet tall in real life. So I think that was part of it too, wanting to emphasize, I mean, how big of a presence, both physically and her oration, and how much of a presence that had. I mean, she was able to, she ended up like meeting Abraham Lincoln. Like, she had really deep connections with churches and with political people. You know, it was, yeah, I like to imagine, and especially knowing that I don't know so much about who designed the Rosa Parks statue, but looking at Tina Allen's work, it seems to be her motivation was to emphasize the most memorable aspects of her subjects, and for Truth, that was her actual size, and just how much of a presence she demanded from an audience that wasn't really receptive, but ended up being. That was part of my first paper, was saying that you know, they didn't want to be receptive, but they had to. That was kind of what the newspapers conceded to. All right, another comment from Joe Ellen. Looks like that might be for Paul, directed toward baseball. Minnie Forbes, the last Black woman owner of a Negro Leagues team, is still alive and well in Grand Rapids. She owned the Detroit Stars and was earlier in association with the Kansas City Monarchs. Mm-hmm. Yes, wow.
Yeah, there's a very active Black baseball research community. It's just very focused on baseball, so that the interconnections with social science and some of the other things aren't there. But
and a Black woman too. So
yeah,
no, they finally about 2 years ago put up an exhibit about women and women owners.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there's also a Women in Baseball committee. They're working on many of those things too. So,
well, thank you all for coming out.